Imagine you're sitting across from a landlord in 2019. You've got a stable job, decent savings, and you're looking at a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized Australian city. The rent is $1,400 a month. It's a stretch, but you make it work. Fast forward to today. Same apartment, same street. Same cracked tiles in the bathroom that were never fixed. The rent is now $2,200 a month, and there are 43 other people who applied before you even walked through the door. What happened? What on earth happened in 5 years that turned an uncomfortable but manageable housing market into something that feels like it was designed specifically to grind ordinary people into the dirt? Because I can promise you this, the answer is not what most people think it is. It's not one villain. It's not one policy. It's not one generation's fault. It's a machine. A slow-moving, interlocking economic machine that was built over decades, and it finally hit full speed right when millions of Australians were at their most vulnerable. By the time we're done here, you're going to understand that machine better than most economists explain it on television. And more importantly, you're going to understand why it's so hard to fix, and what would actually have to change for rents to come back down to earth. Let's start at the very foundation. Because if you don't understand where Australian housing came from, you can't understand where it's going. Australia built its post-war identity on a very specific dream, the quarter-acre block, the detached home with a backyard, and the hills hoist in the garden. Home ownership wasn't just a financial goal. It was a cultural cornerstone. Governments of every stripe, for decades, actively subsidized and encouraged people to buy homes. Low-interest loans, first homeowner grants, tax incentives. The entire architecture of Australian economic policy was tilted toward ownership. And for a long time, that worked. By the 1970s and 1980s, Australia had one of the highest home ownership rates in the developed world. But here's where things started quietly going sideways. In 1985, the Hawke government introduced a tax policy that would slowly, almost invisibly, reshape the investment landscape. Negative gearing, the ability to claim losses on an investment property against your total taxable income, had existed in various forms before, but reforms in 1987 locked in its scope and made it one of the most powerful wealth-building tools available to ordinary Australians with a bit of capital. Pair that with the 50% capital gains tax discount introduced in 1999, and suddenly the calculus for buying an investment property completely. Think about what this meant in real terms. If you were a nurse, a teacher, a tradie earning a solid, but not spectacular income, and you could borrow money to buy a property, take a loss on it every year, use at loss to reduce your tax bill, and then sell it down the track for a profit, where only half that profit was taxed, you weren't just buying a house. You were buying a tax shelter that happened to have walls and a roof. The property didn't even need to make money in the short term. The whole system rewarded you for it losing money, as long as the value kept rising. And values did keep rising, consistently, reliably, for 30 years, which attracted more investors, which pushed prices higher, which attracted more investors. Round and round. Now, before anyone misreads this isn't about blaming investors as individuals. Rational people responding to rational incentives is not a moral failing. The issue is structural. The incentive system was built in a way that made housing simultaneously a social good, a place where people live, and the financial instrument, a vehicle for wealth creation. And when those two things compete, the financial logic tends to win. Here's where the rental crisis connects. Every property bought by an investor as a tax-efficient wealth vehicle is a property that a potential first home buyer didn't purchase. Over time, that means more people renting for longer, more demand in the rental market, more pressure on prices. But for most of the 1990s and 2000s, supply kept pace. Australia was building. Immigration was steady. Interest rates, while not trivial, were manageable. The pressure existed, but it was a slow simmer. Then came 2020. The pandemic years created an economic anomaly that almost nobody predicted correctly. When COVID hit, The conventional wisdom said property values would fall, unemployment would rise, people would default, prices would correct. Many economists said it openly. It didn't happen. Instead, three things occurred simultaneously that lit the housing market on fire. First, interest rates were slashed to near zero. The Reserve Bank of Australia cut the cash rate to 0.1%, the lowest in its history, and held it there for almost 2 years. This meant borrowing was extraordinarily cheap. Someone who could previously borrow $600,000 at 4% could suddenly borrow significantly more for the same monthly repayment. Borrowing capacity exploded. And when borrowing capacity explodes, so does competition for property. So do prices. Second, Australians who kept their jobs, and many did, particularly in white-collar roles that transitioned to remote work, were saving at rates they'd never experienced before. No holidays, no restaurants, no concerts. Household savings ratio spiked to levels not seen since the 1970s. That money didn't sit still. It moved, and a significant portion of it moved into property, because shares felt volatile and property felt safe, and the interest rates on savings accounts were essentially zero. Third, and this is the part that's often overlooked in casual conversation, internal migration patterns shifted dramatically. Remote work decoupled where you lived from where you worked for the first time for millions of Australians. People left expensive Sydney apartments and moved to regional New South Wales. People left Melbourne and moved to Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo. They moved to the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, Byron Bay, Hobart. These regional and lifestyle markets, which had historically had soft rental demand, were suddenly overwhelmed by people with Sydney and Melbourne incomes and budgets. Local renters who might have been earning regional wages found themselves competing against people who could afford to pay much, much more. So you had cheap money, high savings, and demand spreading to places that had never experienced it before, all at the same time. Prices moved fast. Then, as vaccines rolled out and borders opened, something else happened. Immigration returned, not slowly. Fast. Australia had effectively paused its migration program for 2 years. When it restarted, it came back with force. Net overseas migration in the financial year ending June 2023 was the highest in Australia's recorded history. Over 500,000 people. Now, to be absolutely clear, this is not about the origins or backgrounds of those people. It is purely a matter of mathematics. 500,000 additional people had somewhere to live. Australia had not built enough homes to absorb a 2-year backlog of migration on top of existing demand. The pipeline of new dwellings simply wasn't there. Why wasn't it there? Because construction had its own crisis running in parallel. The pandemic disrupted global supply chains in ways that hit residential construction particularly hard. Timber prices surged, steel prices surged. The cost of imported fixtures, fittings, windows, and electrical components all rose sharply. Then there was the labor problem. Construction workers or tradies, concreters, framers, electricians had been in short supply even before COVID. The pandemic made it worse. Skilled migration, which Australia had traditionally relied on to supplement its construction workforce, had paused. Training pipelines were disrupted, and when demand for new builds exploded, as people with pandemic savings tried to build their dream homes, the industry simply couldn't keep up. Builders were quoting prices, locking in contracts, and then discovering months later that the materials they'd quoted on were now 30% more expensive. Dozens of construction companies entered insolvency, projects stalled, apartment developments that had been approved and pre-sold were put on ice because the numbers no longer added up. The development pipeline that should have been delivering new rental supply was constrained precisely when it was needed most. So let's stack these forces together, because this is the machine I mentioned at the beginning. You have a long-term policy framework that made property investment highly tax-advantaged, which increased investor demand and kept potential buyers in the rental pool longer. You have a pandemic that generated cheap credit, high household savings, and redistributed rental demand to markets that couldn't absorb it. You have a migration rebound that was among the largest in the country's history, and you have a construction sector that was simultaneously battling material cost inflation, labor shortages, and insolvency crises that killed the very supply that should have been arriving. Any one of these factors alone would have been a headache. All of them together, arriving within a 4-year window, created the crisis renters are living through right now. But here's where it gets even more complicated. And this is the part that really doesn't get discussed enough. The rental market is not one market. It's dozens of micro-markets behaving in different ways. And when averages are quoted in news reports, they can mask what's actually happening on the ground. In some inner-city apartment markets, the rental crisis looks like 50 applications on a one-bedroom flat within 24 hours. In outer suburban markets, it looks like rents that jumped 35% in 2 years, and then stabilized, but stabilized at a level that's permanently changed what working-class families can afford. In regional markets, it looks like rental vacancy rates of under 1% in towns that had never had a housing problem in their history. In the student accommodation market near universities, it looks like international students sleeping in cars or living 5 to a room because purpose-built student accommodation was never built at the scale needed. Each of these markets has its own local texture, its own specific causes, but they're all connected by the same underlying economic forces. Now, what about the people who own rental properties? Because there's a narrative on both sides of this debate that often oversimplifies. On one side, landlords are characterized as passive wealth extractors sitting back while tenants suffer. On the other side, landlords are characterized as small mum and dad investors who are themselves squeezed by rising mortgage costs. Both contain some truth, and both miss important nuance. The reality is that Australia's landlord class is deeply heterogeneous. The majority of individual investment property owners do own just one investment property. Many of them purchased it as a retirement strategy in lieu of adequate superannuation, because for their generation, property was the only reliable vehicle for building long-term wealth. When interest rates rose from 0.1% to 4.35% in just 18 months, the fastest rate hiking cycle in an Australian history, the mortgage costs on those investment properties rose dramatically. Some landlords genuinely passed on real cost increases. Some used the cover of a hot market to go significantly further. The market didn't distinguish between the two. What the market did do was create conditions where almost any rent increase was absorbed, because there was nowhere else for renters to go. Vacancy rates in major cities fell below 1% in 2022 and 2023. When you have that kind of vacancy rate, the negotiating power of a tenant is essentially zero. You take what's offered, or you don't get a roof. That dynamic, independent of any individual landlord's intentions, allowed rents to rise at a pace that hadn't been seen in a generation. And here's the cruel arithmetic that sits at the heart of this crisis. Wage growth, while it has picked up in recent years, did not move at anything close to the pace of rental increases. In the 2 years following the pandemic, some rental markets saw increases of 25%, 30%, even 40%. Wages in the same period grew at roughly 3 to 4% annually. The gap between what people earn and what they pay to have a roof over their heads widened, in some markets, catastrophically fast. The groups hit hardest were predictable, because housing crises always flow downhill. Low-income renters, people on welfare and disability payments, single-parent families, young people in their first jobs, international students. These are the households with the least negotiating power, the least savings buffer, and the fewest alternatives. The concept of housing stress, defined as paying more than 30% of your gross income on rent, which was once considered a serious warning indicator, became almost normal. In some low-income demographics in major cities, households were paying 40%, 50%, even 60% of income on rent. At that point, housing isn't just expensive, it's consuming the financial oxygen that people need to eat properly, access healthcare, save for emergencies, and build any kind of future. Homelessness numbers are a lagging indicator. They take time to show up in official statistics, but services on the ground reported surges in demand starting from late 2022 that continued through 2023 and into 2024. More disturbingly, the profile of people seeking emergency housing assistance began to shift, where once these services predominantly supported people with complex needs, mental health issues, addiction, domestic violence, they began seeing more people who were simply working renters who had been priced out of the market. People with jobs, people who had never engaged with crisis services before, people for whom one rent increase was the difference between housed and not. This is the real texture of the crisis, not just numbers on a graph, not just a policy debate. Real people doing everything they were supposed to do, discovering that the flaw had been removed. So what would actually fix it? Because any honest account of this issue has to grapple with solutions, even if solutions are genuinely hard. The near unanimous consensus among housing economists, and this is one of the rare areas where there is genuine broad agreement, is that supply is the dominant long-run solution. More homes, more apartments, more density, particularly in the middle suburbs of major cities where infrastructure already exists, but zoning rules restrict the number of dwellings that can be built. More social and affordable housing, because the market will never price efficiently serve the lowest income cohorts without subsidy. Faster planning approvals, reduced construction costs through workforce expansion and materials procurement reform. Australia's governments have announced targets. The National Housing Accord set a goal of 1.2 million new homes over 5 years. Whether the construction sector has the capacity to hit that target, given everything discussed above, is a genuinely open question. The early signs suggest the target will be missed, not because no one cares, because the structural constraints, land costs, construction costs, labor availability, planning bureaucracy, don't disappear because a target has been announced. On the demand side, the conversation about tax incentives, negative gearing and the capital gains discount comes up repeatedly. The economic case for reform is substantial. Multiple reviews and independent economists have argued that these concessions inflate demand, distort investment toward existing housing rather than new supply, and represent a regressive tax expenditure that disproportionately benefits higher income earners. But reform has proven politically explosive every time it's been seriously proposed. The debate continues. There are also discussions about build-to-rent developments, which are common in the United States and much of Europe, but have struggled to gain traction in Australia because the tax treatment makes them uncompetitive compared to the traditional investor model. Regulatory changes to make build-to-rent more viable could, over the medium term, add a significant new stream of professionally managed rental supply. None of these solutions are fast. None of them would meaningfully move rents in the next 12 months. That's perhaps the most uncomfortable truth in all of this. The forces that created this crisis took decades to develop. The forces that will resolve it, if they arrive, will also take years to work through. In the meantime, millions of Australians are making decisions they shouldn't have to make. Moving further from jobs and schools, moving back in with parents, moving in with housemates long past the age they expected to. Some are leaving altogether, moving to New Zealand or Southeast Asia or the UK, citing the cost of living as a primary driver. The country is quietly exporting its own people because it can't house them affordably. That's the machine built over decades, accelerated by a pandemic, strained to breaking point by a migration rebound into a market that wasn't ready, and now operating at a speed and scale that's reshaping what ordinary Australian life looks and feels like. Understanding how a problem works doesn't make it hurt less, but it does make it harder to be distracted by simple answers and single villains. The rent crisis isn't a conspiracy, it's a convergence. And convergences, by their nature, require solutions that work on multiple fronts simultaneously: supply, tax settings, construction capacity, wages, and social safety nets, because pulling on just one thread won't unravel something this tangled. You came to understand something real today. And if this kind of deep dive economic storytelling is what you're looking for, the kind that gets past the headlines and into the actual machinery of how the world works, then subscribe. Hit that button right now, because this is what this channel does. Every single week, we take the stories that feel complicated and overwhelming, and we break them down until they make sense. The housing crisis was just the beginning. There's a lot more machine to open up. Subscribe. You'll want to be here for what comes next.